Good morning. Just one more thing about Bill Borden. When Bill Borden died at age 25 in Cairo, it's an interesting thing because he died in April of 1913. And it was just 4 years later that Oswald Chambers died in Cairo. Any of you familiar with the name Oswald Chambers? His wife took some of his talks, put them together in a little booklet that we read called My Utmost for His Highest. And he died of complications from a burst appendix when he was working with the YMCA with the British military in the First World War in Cairo. Honestly, I hadn't thought that thought till I just got up here. And that scares Ruth when I do things, my wife, when I do things. She said, I don't think that was in his notes. It wasn't. But Bill Borden's Bible, ostensibly, as the story goes, was brought back to his mother. And at 3 places in the Bible, she found annotations. The first one was when he had made the decision to go into missions. And after that note, it said, no reserve. And then when he graduated from Yale, because of who he was offered several jobs, well-paying jobs. And after that decline, after he declined that, he wrote, no retreat. And just before he died, apparently in his Bible in a different place, he wrote, no regrets. Now, many of us have heard that story before, but what a great epitaph. No reserve, no retreat, no regret. This morning, I'd like to work from 2 passages of Scripture. One is found in Matthew, the 6th chapter, the 19th verse. It reads like this. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also. I find that a very interesting way to say that, because my tendency, and this is clearly why I'm not Jesus, one of the reasons, but my tendency would be to say where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. But the fact is your heart follows your treasure. So if your treasure is your child, your heart goes there. If your treasure is this, that, or the other thing, that's where your heart and your energies and your motivations go. That's how that works. The second portion of Scripture is found in 2 Psalms, the first few verses of Psalm 89 and Psalm 90. Psalm 89, I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. For I said, steadfast love will be built up forever in the heavens. You will establish your faithfulness. And then Psalm 90, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. I'd like to speak with you for a few moments about why you're here. You're here not because somebody's trying to get you to invest. You're here because you already have. Your heart's following your treasure, if you will. And the challenge with investing is you never know how it's going to work. I've tried a couple things, and Ruth says, you're not doing that again. Because it sounded so good. This past Wednesday, I sat with about 20 folks around a table, and a Ford dealer in our community in Fort Collins was talking about his business. And he said, I've got a question. He gave us a series of questions. And he said, question, how many of you bought Ford stock, and I think he said 6 years ago. Of course, nobody in the room had Ford stock. And he said 6 years ago, Ford stock was $1 a share. That would have been a good deal today. That'd have been good. This is an iPhone. Right here. On the back, it's got an apple with a bite out of it. It's a stylized apple. That wasn't the first logo of Apple. The first logo of Apple was designed by a fellow named Ronnie Wayne, who I understand lives in a double-wide trailer outside Las Vegas today. I believe this is correct. He invested $800 with Steve Jobs, and a few weeks later got nervous about the investment. Got his money back, but I think he got $2,300. It was quite a bit, but he just wasn't sure. If he had left that $800, today, that is $35 billion. See, the problem with investing, though, is you can't be sure. How do you invest? One of the great things about being a grandfather is the first grandchild that was born, I had this different feeling than when our 4 children were born. And the different feeling was, for the first time in my life, I sort of felt immortal. That it's going beyond the next generation. So Ruth and I have made a decision to invest in our grandchildren. Now, we don't have trust funds or anything. It'd be good, but we don't have that. But what we are doing, we're doing certain things, but Ruth has this investment she's making that every time she's with the grandchildren, she journals what she did with them. She gets on my laptop and she journals it. And so she did that with the first grandchild for 18 years. Pictures, took her art, photographed it, put it in the computer. And when she graduated from high school, when Allison graduated from Churchill High School in Eugene, Oregon, 3 years ago, Grandma had gone online to Shutterfly or one of those and made a book, hardcover book with her picture on it, with all of their times together for the last 18 years. There are different ways to invest, aren't there? And Chuck Colson knew about investment. This hatchet man for Nixon who said he would walk over his grandmother to help Nixon win election, who was loved by a group of men when he was a pariah after going down with Watergate. He went down for obstruction of justice, spent 7 months in jail, came out, spent the last 34 years investing in prisoners. This was the first Easter in 34 years that Chuck Colson had not been in a prison somewhere in the world. And when the prison inmates in Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana heard that Chuck was about to go home to Jesus, they remembered something he had said. What Chuck had said was, "When I die, I want to be buried in a pine box." And so these prisoners in whom Chuck had invested went into the prison workshop in Angola State Penitentiary, which is known as a lifer penitentiary. 90% of the men in Angola State Penitentiary, Louisiana, will die there. Because life sentences in Louisiana mean life sentences. And these prisoners went into the prison workshop and made a pine box. And 3 guards from Angola State Penitentiary drove it to Virginia. And the remains of Charles Wendell Colson were buried at Quantico Marine Corps Cemetery with full military honors. And this Wednesday, they will have Chuck's memorial service at the National Cathedral. Investment has ways of paying out that we find sometimes hard to imagine. When I think of investment, I think of my friend John Stowell. John Stowell, when I first came to Bethany as president of the little college over here, when I first came there, he had been a trustee for a bunch of years because he had gone to that school in its early days for 6 months in 1924. It, at that time, was a school engaged in essentially producing pastors, missionaries, so forth, much like Biola in its early days and many schools. He didn't feel he was supposed to be one of those. He felt he was supposed to be a farmer or a rancher, as we say in California. So he didn't go be a preacher or something. He was a rancher for Jesus. He happened to own 50 acres of pears in what is now downtown Sunnyvale. Now, if you're going to own 50 acres of pears, that's a good place to own it. But he never changed. He always wore bib overalls. And so when we were doing a capital campaign, I prayed. We needed a lead gift. And I'm like, I'd never asked anybody for big money or anything. And so I prayed, God help me. And I went over to see John. And we're sitting on his front porch. And he had sold off much of the property. So there were high-rises, apartments, and condos. And this little Green Acres house on a half-acre with a tank house and a couple of cherry and pear trees out in front, and the mailbox was tilted. And John and I sat in overstuffed chairs, and he had his bib overalls. And I said, John, I've been thinking about this capital campaign we're doing. I don't know if you have it, but I was wondering if I were to ask you for $1 million, would I be brash? And he said, oh, no, that's fine. And then he looked at me and said, how soon do you need that? And I passed out because, I'd prayed, but... 6 months later, John passed away, and I went back to his wife because she had been in our meeting. I went back a year later, and I said, I just thought I'd circle back around. Remember the conversation she said about the $1 million? I said, yeah. She said, our family wants to do that. So we ended up building an administration building and so forth, and when they came to dedicate it, one of the grandchildren in her 30s came and talked to the school. And said, I just want to tell you about my grandpa. My grandpa was not a spender. My grandpa was an investor. Because when you spend, you don't get anything back. But investors always get something back. And he said he would fix things 12 times before he'd get a new one, whatever it was. How many identify with that? Or you had people who identify. The wives are going, yes, I wish you'd get a new one. She said, I just want to say something to you young people. She said, my grandpa was an investor. He hated paying money to Uncle Sam in taxes. He'd do almost anything legal to avoid paying money to Uncle Sam in taxes. And one of the reasons that he gave money to help you go to school was that he felt if he invested in you, you would take this message about Jesus around the world, and he would get compound interest on his investment. And he didn't have to give 1 red cent to Uncle Sam. She said, when we cut the ribbon on that building and walk in there, I just want to tell you this, be careful. Treat that building kindly, because that's not just stucco and steel and redwood and glass. That's my grandpa and grandma's life. So just take care of it. Sometimes when you talk about money, and I'm not going to talk about money really, I'm not going to ask for anything because you're already giving, so I don't need, when you talk about it, a lot of times people get real nervous. They start sucking air through their teeth. It's easier if you don't have a crown on one of your front teeth. But people look at this and say, that's $1. That's one of the things it is. If you're stuck in the wilderness and you don't have any way to start a fire, this is great tinder. This is better than dying. This is great in a furniture store if you don't have a measuring tape, because it's about 6 inches long, and I've measured several couches and chairs with this. I'm serious. It's very good. What this really is my life. People say, you only get 1 shot at life, and I say, I'd like to push back on that. I would submit we get 2 shots. I go out and give away my life, we call it work, and they give me these. And then I get to choose whether I hoard it, or whether I spend it, or whether I invest it. This is my life the second time around. What fun. What a hoot to get one more shot at it. To be able to say, I think I'll do it. I think I'll put it in this orphanage in West Africa. Or I think I'll put it over here in this college. Or I think what I'd like to do is put it at a place like Mount Hermon where it generates all kinds of interest over the years. And that's why you're here. You know this. I'm preaching to the choir. But I love this idea that this is my life the second time around. And you never know exactly how the investment is going to work. But of all the investments we can make, when Jesus is the lead investor, when Jesus went to the cross, he wasn't tithing. When Jesus went to the cross, he was doing the whole thing. I have a friend who says Jesus went to the cross to set the price on you so high that he could never be outbid. This is the God who said, let me show you what investment looks like. This is not just words. If it were words, we could write Jesus saves in the northern lights and let it flash for 2,000 years. It's called incarnation. It's God come in the flesh. And when that happens, it's the model. So what we need to understand about this is that Jesus is the lead investor. And he says, would you like to come and invest in this enterprise called the kingdom of God? Because you can't keep it. You can squander it, but you can't keep it. I love what St. Francis of Assisi says. When you go to heaven, you will take nothing with you that you have received, only what you have given. When you go home to Jesus, you take nothing with you that you have received, only what you have given. I have numbers of people who have left their fingerprints on my soul. They invested in me. If I were to ask you, who are the people in your early years, in your elementary school years, that left their fingerprints on your soul spiritually? If there were some of us are here and we say we had nobody like that in our lives. I came to Jesus when I was 20 years old at university of wherever, and I happened to run into some person and that changed my life. But some of us, a bunch of us here, had impacts in our early years. I'm in a small group in D.C., and if I name some of the older guys they're older than I am, that were there, you'd know a couple of them. And I asked that question, who in your early years left their fingerprints on your soul? To a man, they said, my grandmother. You grandmas, you have access to teenage grandchildren like nobody else does. I think it's because sometimes grandparents feel sort of, well, we did our shtick, and so we're disenfranchised. Now we're out here, and we used to be really worth something, but now we're out here. And teenagers feel exactly that way. They're between kids and adults, and so we're out here a little in no man's land, and when we connect, your granddaughter who's 16 can ask you stuff that she could never ask her mom because it'd freak her mom out, so she tells grandma, that whole deal. In a culture where true north is Wikipedia, you can go in and change Wikipedia. This is the Encyclopedia Britannica of our day. You can change, anybody can go on and change it. In a culture where true north is Wikipedia, maybe you become true north for somebody else. Whether it's investment in your own family or investment in this arena. In a culture where we communicate in 144 characters, we're Googling and we're tweeting, and I'm talking to my grandkids and they're texting each other while I'm talking to them. And if you're texting this morning, text the guy on the other end and say, that was a good point. Just go ahead just a second. And people of our generation, those of us who are a bit older, we sort of don't get that. We think like that's rude. And they think it's community. See? I love it when I speak truth. But it's a whole culture that and the huge challenge for these generations. When I speak to young people, I had the privilege of speaking at University of Virginia 5 weeks ago. Walked into a room with 400 university students, like the best and the brightest in this place that Thomas Jefferson created. And these kids have cool heads and hot hearts. They're going to be the next senators and congressmen and biophysicists. And here they have these hearts for Jesus. But I'm looking at the crowd, and I know that 50% of the crowd grew up with no dad at their house. And some of us grew up with no dads at our house. And my dad left my mom after 29 years. So I get that. So when I say to them, I come from a broken home, 50% of the crowd instantly identifies with me. And when we invest in them, when we spend time with them, it's the kingdom of God with skin on it again. When we give resources to help other people spend time with them, it's the kingdom of God with skin on it again. I have young men come to me, 25 years old, said, would you mentor me? And like, I'm old enough to be their grandfather easily. And I say, well, what do you mean? Because when you think of somebody my age, we're thinking, well, if I can get curriculum and materials, we'll do some of this mentoring stuff. And I say, what do you mean? They say, well, hang out. And I say, you mean like Starbucks and hiking? And they say, yeah, that's what. Because unless you've had presence in your life, presence is the best mentoring you will ever get. They took note that they had been with Jesus. Richard Halverson said that preposition with in Mark, when Jesus appointed the disciples to be with him and preach and cast out demons, he said that preposition changed his whole mission, his whole ministry. Nothing has changed. I'm not designed to be alone. I need you to be with me. And if you can't be with me, if you could help somebody else be with me, that's what this is about. That's what this, and you know that. I just wanted to say it again. I've had people leave their fingerprints on my soul, and I want to tell you about two of them real quick. One is my mother. You say, well, of course. Mothers have a unique place for most guys. And I'm 17 years old. I'm going to Cal Berkeley. I'm sowing my wild oats. This is 1959. I didn't have many oats, and they weren't wild by today's standards, okay? But I'm riding a 150cc Vespa motor scooter, right? I bought it. I got it for $400, brand new. I'm in a culture in Colorado now where Harleys are big, and I tell the Harley guys, hey, Vespas are coming back. Be cool. We're good. But one day I pull up to our house at 5209 Congress Avenue in East Oakland. I park my Vespa and I go in the house. It's a little 20s bungalow, like a craftsman bungalow with stucco on it. And I walk in. It's just a little house. It couldn't be bigger than 1,200 square feet or 11. Not very big. And I can't find my mother. And Mom was always home. And she had cookies and vegetables and stuff for me to eat after, She did celery and carrots and stuff. And I can't find my mom. Now, I was raised in a theological context that said, Jesus can come at any moment, and you're gone. When you're 17 at Cal Berkeley and kind of fooling around, and you drive home and you can't find your mother, that's not a good moment. I finally find her. She's in the bedroom. There's a little walk-in closet, and I can hear her. She's on her knees in the closet, and she's praying for me. And she's saying, oh God, a mom's prayer. Oh God, don't let Dick do anything more stupid than he's already done. And here I am, 53 years later. My mom was born on July the 11th, 1910. When she was born, Taft was president. There were 1,000 miles of paved road in the United States. Henry Ford built 10,000 cars that year, all black. The annual per capita income was $985. It was the year Mark Twain died, and 6 weeks after my mom was born here, a young baby girl was born in Albania who spent most of her life in India, and we know her as Mother Teresa. When my mom was 4, the war to end all wars started, and 8 million people died in that war. 2 years after that war started, flu epidemic hit, pandemic around the world. 25 million people died of flu. When my mom was 19 years old, the stock market crashed. She went off to a little Bible college in Southern California called Southern California Bible College and met a tall 6 foot 2 3/4 inch guy by the name of Oliver Foth from Dinuba, California. And they married. And my sister was born in Colusa. They were pastoring a little church. And then I was born in Alameda. And then after that, 3.5 years later, we went to India. And for several years, we were there and then came back. I was brought up in Oakland. I already told you that. But a few months after I married Ruth in 1963, my parents had been having struggles. And you know that old saying, life is what happens when you expected something else. Many of us know that. Almost everybody sitting here. Let me rephrase it. Everybody here knows that, at least if you're over 8. Okay? Life is what happens when you expected something else. And so I get this letter from my father saying that he was leaving. And for the next 40 years, he was gone. And my mom was 54 and had never worked outside the home. She prayed for us every day. She would send verses. She would send cards and underline things. She would call me when I was in D.C. You know, she was in her 80s by that time. She'd call me and say, are you wearing your overcoat, Dick? You got your galoshes, what she called galoshes, you know, rubber boots. She said, are you wearing those? You know, and I'm like in my 50s, and I'm saying, yeah, I'm good, you know. But she had to go out and teach herself to type so she could get a job. She got a job at Huntington Hospital in Pasadena and was there till she was 71, and they came and said, you're too old, Gwen. And so she went across the street to a posh nursing center or a retirement center called the Californian and worked there till she was 80 or 81. She drove in Southern California till she was 92. You may have seen her on I-5. She wasn't one of those little old ladies in tennis shoes from Altadena. No. She thought she was still in India. She just put the pedal to the metal. When you rode with my mother, your prayer life increased. It was just unbelievable. And she always faced life with music. She was a wonderful concert pianist and organist with music and her strong belief in Jesus, that he would be her husband and care for her in the midst of all things. And she loved her neighbors, which were us, the kids, not physically close to her, but that's how she lived her life. And she always met it with humor, much like Ronald Reagan, much like that quote. She always did that. When I was president here at the college, she was 80. I get this call one morning from a Pacific Bell operator, and said, Mr. Foth, are your phones okay at your house? I said, I think so. They said, well, was there any buzzing, any kind of thing like that? And he said, no, I didn't hear any buzzing. I didn't hear any. She said, well, we thought we'd call and check it out. I do hear that, but I didn't. So that would call and check because there was apparently some static on your line. I said, really, did my wife call you? He said, no, your mother. Gwendolyn Foth, 714 area code, Pasadena. I said, yes. She tried to call you last night and couldn't get through, thought maybe something was wrong and called us and asked us to check on you. I said, well, thank you very much. That's really great. And she said, and by the way, she wanted us to tell you that she has a doctor's appointment today, but it's nothing serious. Only an 80-year-old mom could get a Pac Bell operator to call and tell you that stuff. You know, that's just... Mom pulled out of her driveway one morning, backed out, and a guy T-boned her. Just hit her. Actually, she was going through an intersection. He ran a red light and T-boned her. And Mom was old school. She would dress up to go to the grocery store. Nice dress, nylon, high heels, you know, and she would just do that. And so, I mean, it really shook her up. And the police came. They said, "Are you hurt, ma'am?" She said, "No, I think I'm fine." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I'm good. And my mom looked out the window. Apparently, she was still in the car. She looked out the window and said, "But boy, we killed that poor little dog in the collision. And the officer said, ma'am, he said, that little dog, we killed that poor little dog in the collision. The officer looked at her and said, ma'am, that's not a dog, that's your wig. What's funny about that is that Mom had to tell that on herself because she was alone. Nobody was in the car with her. She came back. You say, what does that have to do with anything about investment or the generations? The people in your life that shape you are the people who have a view of the world that doesn't take themselves very seriously, but absolutely takes Jesus and other people seriously. And she got Alzheimer's when she was late in life, and she would call, and we'd sort of have to find our way through things in that. But it was okay. Her heart was still for God, and when we'd pray, she was right there. She'd pray. Mom went home to Jesus a year ago this past summer. She was 100 years and 4 weeks old. I think she got to 100 and said, I believe I'm out. Let's just let the boy take this and I'm just gone. But she left her fingerprint. She made investment in me by how she approached tragedy, how she looked at life, what she thought about Jesus. There was a time when she couldn't play the piano, and we went to visit her in the hospital. She had an infection, and I had a young aide with me from Washington, D.C. I had flown out. He's now a captain in the Air Force and Army, and Air Force chaplain in Afghanistan. And we went to see my mom, and my sister was there, and she hadn't played the piano for 2 years. And after our 30-minute conversation, she was a little in and out. She said, would you like me to play something for you? We're in the social center of this hospital, families around, and we said, yeah, we wheeled her over to the spinet. My sister helped her get her hands on the keys, and all of a sudden she started to chord, and then she started to do arpeggios, and then she threw her head back, and she started to sing at age 97. I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have Jesus than riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be held in his nail-scarred hand than to be the king of a vast domain. When she got done, the place exploded, people cheering. And my young aide was standing in the doorway with tears in his eyes, saying, this is unbelievable. The God who touches us deep in our spirit, and spirit is deeper than the cortex of the brain. And when the brain doesn't work so well, this Jesus still is investing in us by his Spirit and through his word. Isn't that how it is? That's how it is. I want to close with one more story. People like me close 3 times. I was 10 years old, and I was at a camp. And the reason I want to tell you this story is that it's about like Mount Hermon. It's like a camp. I'm at this camp. I'm 10 years old. I'd never been to a camp. And there was a guy who was the speaker. He was 38 years old. He was way old. His name was Roy. And he dressed up like an army guy. And he had a helmet and fatigues and boots and a .38 revolver, which is always great for kids' camp. And he would tell us stories about Jesus, and he'd tell us stories about Herman the horse and the royal pig, and stories that had moral to them, and he'd shoot the gun every night, And he'd say, you ready to shoot the gun? And we're like 10 years old, and the boys are on this side, and the girls are on that side, because that's just yucky, And so he'd hold the gun up, he'd say, okay, count. We'd go 1, 2, 3, and he'd go click and fire on an empty chamber. He'd say, let's try it again. 1, 2, 3, click, fire on an empty chamber. One more time, one last time. 1, 2, 3, click, fire an empty. And then as he dropped his hand saying, well, I guess it's not going to work, he'd go, blam! We always knew it was going to be the 4th deal. We knew that. And when you're a kid, you want it always the same. You want to know. Blam, he'd do that. He had a dummy named Jimmy, and I like to sit in the front row. And one night, Jimmy talked to me. He said, "Hi, Dick, how you doing?" I said, "I'm good. I'm good." The next day, I'm the big man on campus. "Hey, there's the kid the dummy talked to, over there." He taught us the books of the Bible to a song. Some of you may even know it. "Come, let us Christians try to tell books of the Bible we know so well. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 St. Samuel, 1 St. Kings, Chronicles and Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon and Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah, Joel, and Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, back Zephaniah, Guy, Zechariah, Malachi, and Math." You know that song. And so... "8 years later, when I transferred from Cal Berkeley to this college campus, they gave us a Bible test at the front end, said, write down as many books of the Bible as you know. And all around the room, you heard kids going, no, 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 no. You never know when you invest in a 10-year-old how it's going to turn out. You just don't know, because it's like a seed in the ground. And you can't see what's happening. But it grows because it has life in itself. And that's how it works. He came to me in the cafeteria line, Roy did, and said, "Roy, thanks," or it said, "Dick, thanks for sitting in the front row." I said, "Well, I like Jimmy." He said, "Well, Jimmy likes you." He said, "Always follow Jesus, Dick, and you'll have a great life. It'll always be worthwhile." And I'm 10 years old. I'm okay. And 8 years later, when I walked onto that campus, I met a tall, sandy-haired, green-eyed girl by the name of Ruth, who turned out to be Roy's eldest daughter. I didn't know he had any kids. I thought he just had Jimmy. I didn't know. And Ruth was a lot like Roy. She was affirming. She saw the good stuff. And I was a stutterer. From age 5 to age 28, I stuttered, as I mentioned. And we were dating, and I was nervous, insecure about the relationship. And we're driving down West Cliff Drive down here, and it's romantic, and there's a full moon. But I'm nervous about the relationship. And I turned to Ruth and said, "Ruth, I don't know if you want to still go with me, because I can't talk." And she looked at me and smiled very sweetly and said, "Oh, really? I hadn't noticed." And she was dead serious. And it started unlocking my door and letting me out. And now I talk all the time. Because I have all these words that I saved up. And now I just get them out. And when my parents' thing was coming unraveled, and I was trying to decide whether Ruth and I should be together for the rest of our lives, I was so nervous I thought maybe it was genetic. I thought maybe it was hereditary, and I wouldn't have a snowball's chance in July if I'd got married. And I'm back and forth. And Ruth wrote me a card. And, girls do cards more. Guys are not so big on the card thing. And so she wrote this card, and she wrote in King Jamish or Elizabethan English. This is what she wrote. She wrote, "Ask for my white-gloved hand. The hills to pearl will turn, the sand to diamonds. Ask for my lips to kiss, each star the setting of a diadem shall be. But ask for my love, and heaven to earth shall come. My love be thine." And I read that, and I said, "Hey, hey, hey." So Roy and Opal invested in their own kids, John and Phil and Ruth and Mary and Joanna. And Roy invested 3 weeks a year at summer camps. And my life was touched. After I went to grad school, I went and worked with Roy for 15 months, and he was a visionary. They had a school there in Modesto called Modesto Christian School, and you can go to Surplus, Educational Surplus in Sacramento, where the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines bring their old stuff, and you can get stuff 10 cents on the dollar if you have one of those schools. And so we'd go up there, and he'd see stuff, and he'd want to get it. I mean, just all kinds of things. He was at home. We said, for Roy Blakely, heaven's going to be 1 billion cubic miles of junk. Because how many of you guys are junk guys? Got any junk? We got junk guys here. What I see as trash, he sees as triumph. It's one of those deals. We walked in one day and there was this big yellow thing with hoses and tires. And he said, what is that? And the guy said, that is a turbine starter for an F-4 Phantom jet. And Roy turned to me and said, Foth, we need to get this. And I said, why? I said, what? And he said, well, we might get a jet, and besides that, it's only $250 and the tires are worth that much. We hauled that thing back to Modesto, put it in a barn, never did get a jet. He tried to sell it back to Castle Air Force Base. They weren't buying it. And so when we went to D.C., and we didn't know what we were going to do exactly. We were going to this amorphous kind of situation to work behind the scenes and discipling one-on-one with leaders. People were saying, Foth, you're nuts. You're 51 years old. Why are you doing that? And Roy said, we need folks in D.C. to help the other folks there. So it's a good thing, Dick. So we loaded up a 26-foot U-Haul truck, leased our home here in Scotts Valley, and drove to D.C. in the summer of '93 with no office, no money, no any of that. And the Lord provided, because that's what he does. When you step out, that's what he does. 6 months after we got to D.C., the phone rang early in the morning, end of January, and they said, it was Ruth's sister saying, Daddy died in his sleep last night. And we flew back. He was a person who he probably wouldn't have spoken at Mount Hermon. He just wasn't known in that way. But he loved his town, and he loved the guy at the feedlot, and he loved the guy at the gas station. And somebody asked about him after his death how he saw discipleship. And his definition of discipleship, according to an architect that was asked, would Roy Blakely believe the discipling was make a friend, take him with you. And that's what he did. That's what he did with me. So we get up early in the morning, and Mom Blakely says, anybody want any of Granddad's old hats? Because in his heart, he was a farmer. He had 15 acres of what they call in Modesto almonds. The rest of the civilized world says almonds, but in that area from Sacramento down to Bakersfield, they're almonds. Some of you know that. And he used to putt around in this old tractor. People would give him caps. He had all these old greasy caps. So all of us took some of his greasy caps. We're driving to the service. They had 2 services, one for the public and one for the family. 1,000 people at the public service. His church was never larger than 400. Guys from Sacramento Surplus showed up, signed in, Harry and Joe, Sacramento Surplus. I have no idea how they knew. Had the family time, and I'm supposed to close it, and I'm scrambling. What do I say? Because all these people, somebody stood up and read 1 Corinthians 13 and said, that was Roy Blakely, and sat down. And I'm saying, what do you say after that? And I had this thought that at heart he was a farmer. And farmers aren't just planters and nurturers and harvesters. Farmers are salvagers. And he used to have all this junk in his garage and in the barn. I'd say, what is that? He'd say, that's stuff. I'd say, what are you going to do with it? He'd say, I'm going to use it. I'd say, when? He'd say, sometime. And on the way to the funeral service, the memorial service, I had this thought that he saw people exactly the same way he saw things, that they were too good to throw away. End of the service came, 13 grandsons sitting in the front row from age 7 to age 29. The music was done, the eulogies were over. They stood up to carry out the casket, and all the boys reached down under the pew and pulled out one of those old greasy caps. Wiped us out. Big boys carried it out, little boys trailing behind. We got outside, and one of the sons said, we're going to drive by the old home place just one last time on the way to the cemetery in Escalon out in the country. So we drove out Ladd Road. The spring was just coming to the vineyards and the orchards. And we got to the house at the corner of Ladd and Carver, north of Modesto. And the hearse slowed, just like dipping the flag to a fallen soldier. And when that happened, the second car with the boys in it started honking its horn. And suddenly 60 cars, the family start honking their horns. And suddenly the windows come down on that second car and these greasy caps come out the window. And the boys start shouting, Granddad, you did it. Granddad, you did it. Suddenly sunroofs are back and hankies are waving and cheers are ricocheting out through the orchards. And I'm saying, what did Granddad do? What Granddad did was he believed in investing in the generations. What Granddad did was he let his heart follow his treasure. What Granddad did was to love the Lord his God with all of his heart and love his neighbor as himself. And they had 23 grandchildren with the fingerprints of God on their souls because somebody took the time to invest. My father-in-law and my mother-in-law did not spend their lives. They invested him because God's faithfulness is true from generation to generation. So there.